A long time ago, I stated that it's one thing to know something, but it's an entirely different thing to internalize it. And another way of putting that is, it's one thing to know something, it's an entirely different thing to put it into practice. But we can further expand upon the notion of knowing something versus internalizing it in the sense of knowledge is sometimes just not sufficient in order to get the job done. There are many things we know, some of them complex, some of them not so complex, that we ought to put into practice, but don't do so. There are many things we know that should inform us as to what we should and should not do in our lives, and oftentimes we end up engaging in the more damaging option as opposed to the more beneficial one. You see this constantly. Probably the most overt manifestation of this phenomenon would be any form of regular substance abuse. So whether you're an alcoholic, a chain smoker, or even a food addict, I think it's kind of obvious when you look at what we know these days. Most people who are chain smokers know that smoking is bad for them, but they do it anyway. Most people who are obese or very overweight know that eating excessive amounts of calories isn't good and it's making them fat and fatter. And most people who are in love with the bottle know ultimately it's not good for them either. They might not know all the nitty-gritty details or the specific medical reasons why they shouldn't be doing it, but they know it's bad. It's not good for them in the most holistic sense of that phrase. Well, of course, here you have the interplay of a lot of different factors. In this case, the absolute interplay of genes. It's been well documented that substance abuse is highly heritable. For example, nicotine addiction has a heritability rate, depending on the study, of 60 to 80%, very high. And it's quite similar with alcohol. So we know why, at least in part, some of these people might struggle. But setting aside all these factors that go into an addiction, in this specific case, it's difficult to think of incentives not to do it. Well, you might say health. But as I've pointed out many times, health is not a great motivator for many people. And there's several reasons for this. One reason is you just don't have the social network such that you care about yourself with respect to them and vice versa. No one's going to take care of you or help you out, and you have no one to take care of or help out. You don't have any friends, any family. In that case, it's difficult to be motivated to quit a substance, especially if that substance is offering you a little something that takes the edge off of your life. Why do many people not exercise? Well, in many cases, the people who do exercise do it for purely vain reasons. I've mentioned this several times. So there are a lot of factors going into why people don't act in the best way, despite having at least the rudiments of knowledge such that they could act in a better way that would be more beneficial to their individual lives. Before exploring this topic any further, I have to offer some provisos. Namely, obviously, I of all people am going to acknowledge all the causal forces that predate an individual such that he ends up in the situation that he is, whether it's a drug addiction, food addiction, whatever it might be. There are huge, powerful genetic factors at play, and there are environmental factors at play too that he or she had no control over, etc., etc. So I am not claiming throughout this video that humans are agents. Quite the opposite, as you'll see. I'm going to claim in this video that humans are animals, and like most animals, we respond to incentives. So what I'm arguing here is not that human beings are agents. I do not believe we are, but rather we are puppets, and puppets can be manipulated and respond to different incentives. Okay, so we have this problem, right? We know that people are addicted to things. We know that, for example, there's an obesity epidemic. We know all these things, and we have to ask ourselves, in a causal sense, why? Well, some of it is kind of obvious. There would almost certainly be no obesity epidemic were there not an overabundance of cheap junk food available that you can get pretty much anywhere, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, on the fly, whenever you want, with few to no problems. That is the very first prerequisite for it, right? Because if all these people could only get cucumbers, carrots, and apples, it would be a lot harder for them, I suppose theoretically possible, to become obese. Now, there are other reasons why people are not motivated, though, to combat this. Yes, it's very difficult. I, of all people, take into account genetic predilections. Now, people talk about fat shaming, etc., etc. I don't think it's as simple as that. Yes, we are laxer about, quote unquote, judging people for figures that we, at earlier times, might have judged to be repulsive or absolutely unacceptable. But I think this is far more a question of disconnect between the ruling class and those beneath them, unfortunately. I've sometimes brought up this notion taken from the French that has been applied throughout history, particularly in English history, but not just there, throughout Europe, of noblesse oblige, this notion that the nobility, the ruling class, is somehow obligated to tend to the needs of those beneath them. It sounds awful, but that's how it was viewed. But the nobles of today, these would-be gods that many benighted young people look up to, are not role models in the truest sense. They're not actually and actively looking out for the interests of people who are less fortunate than them. Not at all in most cases. They're in it for themselves. And I believe that disconnect prevents the establishment of a connection such that these people think it's a reasonable thing to strive for various goals. Now, there's a kind of version of this, and that's why I mentioned would-be gods and false idols. These would-be gods, these idols that people look up to these days, do not have a connection or concern for the people that they view as being beneath them. And so the quote-unquote correct behavior, which I would argue they're not even displaying, is not being incentivized in the quote-unquote underclasses. Let's be honest. The worst and most pernicious problems of addiction, whether it's food, drug, alcohol, is most highly concentrated in those who are socioeconomically in the lower rungs of society. And there are all sorts of reasons for this. That's a separate discussion, separate video, maybe a separate topic. But we know now that contrasting the current epoch with the days of yore, say 1950s, 60s, etc., in the United States specifically, that the connection between those who ruled, the upper class, the wealthier people, and the people who were not as fortunate was far less tenuous than it is now. There was a greater sense of civic duty. And so the upper class felt at least somewhat compelled to nominally behave in a quote-unquote virtuous way, thereby creating behavioral incentives for people who were, for better or worse, quote-unquote, beneath them. So really, at the end of the day, we do have a crisis of incentives because the ruling class, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, or the people at the top, aren't interested in acting as role models for the rest of us. They're interested in lining their own pockets. They're interested in maybe manipulating us. They're interested in getting ahead. And some of them might play the nominal game of noblesse oblige and their obligations to others. But for the most part, they're transparent and solve prevarication. It's just not true. They're not trying to actually do that or help people. So incentives matter, but the incentives need to come from somewhere. You add to this miasma of Instagrammers and TikTokers and YouTube shorters and whatever that a lot of the youth want to look up to. That's their incentive. They think that is the pinnacle of human existence. And I suppose it is. I mean, I don't know what it's like, but I guess for some of these people, they post a video of some silly skit or stunt. They get tens of thousands of dollars for a brief video doing basically nothing that involves just a little bit of silliness. And sure, easy money, I guess. And a lot of people find that desirable. But in a lot of ways, this lack of connection between the different class structures throughout society has led to this affair of confusion. There is not really a good answer to the question these days of what is the good life. That goes way, way back. The Greeks were asking this question. But at least on some level, maybe 50, 60 years ago, there would have been some vague consensus on what that constituted. Not so much anymore. In the era of anything goes and free to be you and me, that is an unanswerable question, basically. But the problem really is that a lot of people need a blueprint that they can follow. Most people aren't going to just luck out and become Instagram or TikTok stars, or they elsewise don't have the cognitive abilities to become insanely rich in the current meta of the so-called cognitive economy. And what they used to have, say the working class specifically, were people they could look up to. And they could live what some people would deem a dignified life, doing basic stuff, getting by, and remaining reasonably healthy. The connection has been severed. That's why the incentives suck. Many people need a blueprint. They need something to look up to that's worthy of pursuing. And they need to have the sense, whether it's fictitious or not, that the people that are quote unquote above them, right, are looking out for their interests or even care on some level, that there's some connection. And this is something I've talked about a lot, but let's be perfectly honest here. The stratification in the United States is such that that's impossible. Seen from this context, the humans of the United States have basically become different subspecies in a cultural and economic sense. There's no ability for one to relate to the other, not really. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. So people need role models, for lack of a better term. It's true. People need things they can follow. What are the role models today? Random Instagrammers, TikTokers, YouTubers, people online who think that they're demigods? Or these gurus who are trying to bilk people out of their money and manipulate them? Or the people in Stanford and Harvard and Washington who live in palaces in the clouds or the equivalent and don't even acknowledge these people's existence? Things are really coming apart, no pun intended. And all the knowledge-based incentives, like being healthier, doing the right thing, don't seem very good when there's no reward for them. People talk constantly about discipline and how discipline eats motivation. You need some kind of motivation, some kind of reason to want to do something. And if people can't be presented a good one, or there's none at all, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to lose themselves in food, drugs. They're going to waste away, which is what is happening. But no, the ties that bind have been severed. Certainly nobody's talking about reestablishing ties. No, it's a splintered, disheveled, and rudderless society. People have forgotten that the average person needs some kind of blueprint to follow. Where is that blueprint these days? So much can be derived from this. There need to be good reasons, and people need to set examples. But the examples that people look at are either unattainable, ridiculous, quote-unquote degenerate, or lacking in virtue, and just not something worthy of pursuing. It's a bit of a meme, but we do live in a society. And ultimately, at some point in time, the fact that we live in a society will have consequences. We ignore this at our own peril. Thanks for tuning in. As always, special thanks to my patrons. Really appreciate you. You keep the channel going. Many thanks to you. And if you can engage in the usual YouTube jazz, which means liking the video, sharing, subbing if you're not yet a subscriber, leaving a comment, that would be much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.